the early years of the war, the Battle of the Atlantic seemed to be one arena where Hitler believed the Third Reich held a decisive edge. German U-boats had prowled the North Atlantic like wolves in a dark sea, severing Britain's lifeline by sinking merchant ships faster than the Allies could replace them. Hitler boasted that the Atlantic would become Germany's hunting ground, a vast domain where the Royal Navy would eventually drown under the weight of its own exhaustion. For a time, these predictions seemed frighteningly accurate, but deep within the war rooms of the Kriegsmarine, the first cracks had already begun to appear. Small warnings, subtle signals, and whispered doubts that the German High Command dared not share with the four, at least not yet. By late 1941, U-boat commanders returning from Atlantic patrols carried more than victory reports. They brought concerns, troubling ones. Convoys that had once sailed helpless and uncoordinated were suddenly moving with disciplined formation. Ships that used to scatter at the first sight of a periscope were now turning aggressively toward U-boats, supported by destroyers that appeared out of fog banks with startling precision. Even worse, commanders noticed that Allied escorts seemed to know where they were before they attacked. German captains reported depth charge patterns that fell with uncanny accuracy, forcing U-boats to dive deeper, maneuver harder, and escape by mere luck rather than skill. Inside the Kriegsmarine headquarters, analysts pinned reports to the walls, drawing long red strings between convoy routes, interception points, and U-boat losses. The pattern was unmistakable. Admiral Karl Dönitz, the architect of the Wolfpack tactic, sensed the shift earlier than anyone else. For years he had championed coordinated submarine attacks as Germany's naval spearhead. But now, as reports came in from the front lines, he noticed something that filled him with quiet dread. Wolfpacks were taking heavier losses. U-boats sent to rendezvous with others often never arrived. Those that did reported being shadowed by aircraft or hunted by escort carriers that roamed farther out into the Atlantic than ever before. Dönitz ran his fingers over casualty lists and understood what the statistics were saying. The ocean was no longer Germany's battlefield. It was becoming a graveyard. Perhaps the most shocking revelation was that Britain's supply lines, despite all the tonnage sunk, had not collapsed. Hitler expected Britain to starve by 1941. Dönitz expected British industry to grind to a halt. German naval intelligence expected the convoy system to buckle under pressure. None of it happened. Instead, British shipbuilding accelerated. American industrial support increased. Convoys grew larger, escorts more numerous, and the much-rumored air gap in the mid-Atlantic, once a safe haven for U-boats, was shrinking rapidly as long-range aircraft began patrolling further out. The illusion of German dominance at sea was fading. Dönitz knew the truth, even if the Führer did not want to hear it. Germany was losing its grip on the Atlantic slowly but undeniably. When he brought his early concerns to senior army staff, they dismissed them as pessimism. When he hinted at these developments in a meeting with Hitler, the Führer brushed it off, insisting that British morale is already broken. But Dönitz had seen the reports, the tonnage numbers, the loss rates, the shifting tides of technology. He knew that if trends continued, the Battle of the Atlantic would become unwinnable. And as 1942 approached, those early cracks in Germany's naval strategy would widen into a chasm. The Kriegsmarine was heading toward disaster, and Hitler had no idea. Through 1940 and 1941, Nazi Germany celebrated the U-boats as the unstoppable predators of the Atlantic. Propaganda declared the Wolfpacks coordinated groups of submarines attacking convoys at night, the dark fist of Hitler's naval power. Newspapers boasted of Allied ships sinking at a rate the British supposedly could not replace. Inside the Reich Chancellery, Hitler believed every word. He saw the U-boats as the weapon that would force Britain into starvation, break American supply lines, and ultimately bring the Western Allies to their knees. The Führer imagined the Atlantic as a sealed cage, and the U-boats its iron bars. But deep beneath the surface of the ocean, the commanders living the reality of the war were seeing something else entirely. The myth of invincibility was starting to crack. By early 1942, the U-boat captains, men like Otto Kretschmer, Erich Taube, and Karl Dönitz, his own Protekis, noticed an unsettling trend. Allied ships were suddenly harder to find. Convoys were better coordinated. Radio communications were crisp. Escort ships appeared faster than before. And above all, Allied aircraft were everywhere. The Atlantic gap once a safe zone where U-boats could surface without fear, was shrinking. New long-range aircraft, like the Beta-4 Liberator, extended air coverage into deep ocean territory. Radar was improving weekly, and sonar, once primitive, was now frighteningly precise. U-boat commanders had a word for this terrifying new reality. Dion Sitber. Hefar. The invisible threat. Something was hunting them, and doing it well. In spring 1942, signals began pouring into German Naval High Command. These were not routine updates. They were warnings. The commanders wrote, Allied escort ships responding with impossible speed. Night surface. Attacks no longer viable. Enemy aircraft appearing without visual detection. Possible new technology. Casualties. Rising. Recommend tactical reassessment immediately. Several U-boats, once responsible for huge kill counts, were suddenly disappearing without a trace. For the first time in the war, U-boat captains were telling Berlin, "We are losing control of the Atlantic." Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat arm, took these reports seriously. He knew his men weren't exaggerating. Many were veterans with dozens of patrols under their belts. If they were complaining, the situation was dire. Dönitz urgently requested more advanced submarines, improved radar detectors, better air support, reductions in surface attacks, a temporary withdrawal from high-risk convoy routes. Hitler rejected most of these concerns. In meetings, he insisted, "The U-boat remains our decisive weapon. Britain will fall by blockade, nothing else." To him, the reports were defeatism. To Dönitz, they were survival. The gap between political fantasy and battlefield reality was widening fast. By late 1942, the statistics were undeniable. U-boat losses were rising sharply. Allied ship losses were falling. Convoys were becoming nearly impenetrable. Wolfpack strategies resulted in ambushes, not victories. The very tactic that made U-boats legendary was now exposing them to coordinated counterattacks. Captains began sending bleak final messages before their deaths. Enemy knows our position before we strike. Wolfpack approach no longer effective. The myth had shattered. The Atlantic, once a hunting ground, was turning into a graveyard. By the autumn of 1942, U-boat commanders were fighting an enemy they could not see, an enemy that always seemed one step ahead. Some believed the British had developed new technology. Others thought the Allies had somehow expanded their air coverage to impossible distances. But in truth, the real weapon shifting the fate of the Atlantic was not radar, aircraft, or escort ships. It was silence, secrecy, and the unbroken discipline of a hidden army working far from the ocean, inside the quiet rooms of Bletchley Park. This unlikely estate in the English countryside housed mathematicians, chess champions, linguists, cryptographers, and engineers who were engaged in a war of logic and patience. Their mission: break the German naval Enigma code. For years their progress was slow, fragile, and often undone whenever the Germans changed settings. But they persisted, and in 1941, a captured U-boat provided the breakthrough they needed. From that moment on, Britain began reading naval messages with increasing accuracy. The Germans had no idea their encrypted communications were being watched. They believed Enigma to be uncrackable, a machine so complex that no enemy could possibly unlock its shifting combinations. That belief allowed Bletchley Park to operate freely in the shadows, as U-boat commanders sent detailed updates about positions, supplies, fuel levels, and rendezvous points. British intelligence intercepted every word. Each message revealed the structure of Wolfpack deployments. Before they happened, convoys that once sailed blindly into danger were now routed safely around U-boat patrol zones. What the Germans misinterpreted as a sudden increase in Allied luck was, in fact, the silent choreography of intelligence guiding ships through the ocean with mathematical precision. The changes were subtle at first. A convoy expected to lose 10 ships lost none. A Wolfpack assembled for a coordinated strike found only empty seas. U-boats reported that convoys seemed to vanish just before contact, as if the British anticipated their every move. But it was not anticipation. It was information. flowing daily through secure channels from Bletchley Park to the Admiral. As Allied intelligence grew more confident, the impact on the battlefield deepened. Escorts began appearing at exactly the right moment, turning ambushes into counter-ambushes. Aircraft were sent to precise coordinates where U-boats had been ordered to surface. Dönitz's carefully planned Wolfpacks suddenly found themselves scattered, hunted, or forced to dive repeatedly to avoid destruction. Time after time, U-boat captains observed patterns that made no sense until a chilling realization spread through the ranks. It seemed the Allies knew. Some German officers whispered that a spy must exist inside the U-boat command. Others believed the British had developed a new detection device capable of hearing or sensing submarines through the ocean floor. The truth was far more devastating. The German Navy was effectively broadcasting its secrets to the enemy without knowing it. Hitler refused to hear any suggestion that Enigma was compromised. To him, the machine embodied German engineering superiority. The idea that anyone, especially the British, could penetrate its codes was unthinkable. His disbelief was another layer of protection for the Allies, ensuring that no changes were made that might close the intelligence window. By early 1943, the British and Americans were coordinating large-scale countermeasures based entirely on decrypted Enigma signals. For the first time in the war, intelligence, not tonnage, not firepower, became the deciding factor in the Atlantic. What the Germans believed to be a battlefield governed by luck was actually a chessboard, one where every move they made was already known. The ocean was vast, but their secrets were no longer hidden. The tide of the Atlantic was turning, not by force, but by knowledge. It began quietly, almost invisibly, in a small complex of wooden huts deep inside Britain's most secret wartime installation, Bletchley Park. While Admiral Dönitz demanded more torpedoes, more sacrifices, a team of mathematicians, linguists, and cryptanalysts was dismantling the German Navy's future one intercepted message at a time. And by early 1943, what those codebreakers discovered would shake the very foundation of Hitler's belief in the Kriegsmarine. For months, the Allies had struggled against the deadly precision of the U-boat Wolfpacks. Every convoy seemed hunted, every route dangerous. But as German naval traffic encrypted through the vaunted naval Enigma filled the airwaves, the codebreakers noticed something disturbing, something that Dönitz never intended anyone to see. The German Navy was losing control of the Atlantic far faster than Hitler realized. The breakthrough came when a string of decrypted communications revealed patterns, rerouted Wolfpack's emergency distress transmissions, and escalating supply shortages. For the first time, analysts saw the truth the Kriegsmarine tried desperately to hide. The U-boats were being destroyed faster than they could be deployed. The once feared Wolfpacks were shrinking, bleeding out across the North Atlantic. Inside Hut 8, young analysts marked each sinking with a quiet tap of a pencil. The map of the Atlantic, once littered with U-boat hunting zones, began to change shape. Circles representing U-boat positions grew fewer, communication density thinned, and messages showed a rare tone of panic in the German reports. Heavy losses. Torpedoes malfunctioning, unable to intercept convoy. These phrases, intercepted in cold military code, painted a picture of desperation. But what stunned British intelligence wasn't just the scale of U-boat deaths. It was a reaction from inside the German command structure. Even as their numbers dwindled, German officers continued sending exaggerated claims of Allied sinkings. Hitler was being fed a fantasy, a picture of a Kriegsmarine that was still feared, still dominant, still capable of starving Britain. In reality, the German Navy had begun fighting blind. The code breakers also uncovered the growing effectiveness of Allied countermeasures. Long-range patrol aircraft, radar advancements, sonar-equipped escorts, and new hunter-killer groups were crippling German attacks at an unprecedented rate. And the Germans, unable to break Allied communications or detect their shifting tactics, had no understanding of how exposed they truly were. One decrypted message in particular marked a turning point. A report from a U-boat commander stating that they were attacked before they could even detect Allied vessels. This was the moment the analysts realized radar had tipped the balance. The Germans weren't hunting anymore. They were being hunted. As these revelations made their way up the chain of command, a grim conclusion took shape. The Battle of the Atlantic was slipping away from Germany, and Hitler didn't know it. Churchill was briefed first. He listened, silent and focused, as the decrypts were laid before him. The German Navy was unraveling, and Hitler's blind faith in Dönitz's Wolfpacks had become a fatal flaw. "The noose," Churchill murmured, "is finally tightening." By the time the intelligence reached Allied naval strategists, they understood they had a decisive window. Every U-boat lost was more than a tactical victory. It was the slow death of Hitler's ability to wage global war. The German Navy could no longer protect the supply lines to Africa, defend its coasts, or even threaten Britain's lifeline at sea. And deep inside Bletchley Park, as another decrypted message confirmed, yet another U-boat destroyed. The codebreakers realized the truth before Hitler ever would. The Atlantic had turned against Germany, and there was no turning it back. It was late in the evening when Admiral Karl Dönitz stepped into the dim corridor leading to Hitler's private briefing room. Outside, the winter wind scraped against the concrete walls of the Wolfschans. But inside the bunker, the air felt heavy, thick with tension, fear, and the stench of a war slipping from Germany's grasp. Dönitz held the simple folder in his hands. Inside it lay the truth he had avoided presenting for months. The Battle of the Atlantic was collapsing. Their U-boats were dying in the cold, dark ocean, and Germany's naval dream was nearly over. Hitler, hunched over maps and scattered reports, barely looked up when Dönitz entered. The Führer was still clutching to the illusion of a victorious navy, a force capable of strangling Britain into submission. His eyes darted over the Atlantic map, dotted with small flags, representing the Wolfpacks he believed were still roaming with deadly efficiency. But the dots were lies, inflated reports, and outdated positions. The reality was far more brutal. Dönitz stood silently for a moment, gathering the courage he seldom needed. He had commanded men for years, men who died in steel coffins beneath the sea, and yet what he was about to do frightened him more than any Allied depth charge. He cleared his throat and spoke, his voice low but steady. "There is a matter you must hear from me directly." Hitler lifted his head. His expression, once sharp and iron-willed, now carried the weight of exhaustion and paranoia. Dönitz opened a folder. Inside were decrypted Allied announcements, captured intelligence, U-boat, casualty lists, sonar detection charts, and the latest reports from his remaining fleet commanders. Hitler scanned the pages, his brow tightening, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Impossible," Hitler muttered. "We are sinking dozens of vessels weekly." Dönitz swallowed. The reports were optimistic, my Führer. Our commanders exaggerated their claims. Many torpedo strikes failed. Some vessels believed sunk were never even damaged. He paused. "We have lost 44 U-boats in the past 90 days. And the Allies," he struggled for a moment, the words reluctant to leave his mouth. "The Allies now detect our subs before we detect them." Hitler stiffened, gripping the edge of the table as if the entire room had shifted under him. "How?" he demanded. "New radar, new aircraft range. Convoys are heavily escorted. Their tactics are changing faster than we can adapt." Dönitz did not mention Enigma, because he did not yet know the full truth, but he knew something was wrong. Too many U-boats were dying in the dark, without ever seeing the enemy. Hitler's face twisted with disbelief. He slammed his fist on the table. "Then build more U-boats. Deploy new Wolfpacks. The Atlantic is vital." "My Führer," Dönitz said, voice breaking through the fear. "We can build them, but we cannot crew them. We are running out of trained men. The ocean is swallowing them faster than Germany can replace them." A long silence filled the room. The maps no longer looked like symbols of power. They looked like open graves. When Hitler finally whispered, "Did this begin?" Dönitz closed the folder. The turning point was months ago, but now the battle is lost unless something drastically changes. For the first time in the war, Hitler said nothing. His jaw trembled slightly. The mighty Wolfpacks he had boasted about in speeches, the terror of the Atlantic he believed would bring Britain to its knees, were gone, and no amount of rage or denial could bring them back. Dönitz stepped out of the bunker minutes later, pale and exhausted. Behind him, Hitler stared at the map, unable to comprehend that his dream of crushing Britain had evaporated into the waves of the North Atlantic. The naval war, his naval war, had ended long before he realized it. By early 1944, deep beneath the Atlantic swells, an unspoken rebellion had begun taking shape, not in the form of defiance or open refusal, but in something far more dangerous to a navy built on loyalty loss of rebellion. For years, U-boat crews had marched proudly into the sea as Germany's elite. They were the hunters, the feared predators of the Atlantic, the men Hitler praised as the iron wolves of his naval masterpiece. But now, as the tide of war shifted violently against Germany, those wolves were beginning to doubt their pack leader. Inside the cramped pressure holes of Type 7 and Type 9 submarines, young sailors whispered in the darkness about the growing casualty lists, about friends who never surfaced again, about missions where they were spotted long before they reached attack position. Every depth charge attack seemed more precise than the last. Every patrol felt less like a hunt and more like a death sentence. The conversations were quiet, murmurs exchanged while reloading torpedoes, confessions spoken in the smoky corners of makeshift mess tables, questions muttered after lights out, when the boat hummed only with the sound of engines and fear. How do they know where we are? Why do they always find us first? Why do they tell us the war's going well when half the fleet is gone? And the most dangerous question of all, does Berlin even know what's happening out here? This was not mutiny in a traditional sense. U-boat sailors were too disciplined, too deeply bound by naval tradition to rebel openly. But the psychological foundation, the faith that carried a man into a steel coffin diving into hostile waters, had begun to crack. The captains felt it first. They had always been composed, authoritative, respected. Now many returned from patrols with haunted eyes, their faces drawn and pale. They delivered speeches to their crews, promising victory, promising new technologies, promising that Germany would soon regain control. But their voices, once filled with confidence, now betrayed uncertainty. They knew the truth, even before Dönitz admitted it to Hitler. The ocean had turned against them. Whispers spread about boats that vanished without sending a final message. Entire Wolfpacks wiped out within days. New recruits barely trained, then rushed into the sea to replace crews who would never come home. Some sailors carved the names of lost friends into the steel bulkheads, quiet memorials hidden from their officers. Others wrote letters they knew might never be delivered. In one U-boat, returning to Lorient, the chief engineer confessed to his captain, "Sir, I don't think Berlin understands what we're facing." The captain looked at him with hollow eyes and answered, "Berlin doesn't want to understand." By mid-1944, morale was collapsing. Boats returned to port with crews so shaken they could hardly stand. Commanders reported sailors suffering from exhaustion, hallucinations, and uncontrollable panic when depth charges exploded nearby. Some crews begged, not for victory, but for shore duty. Anything to avoid returning to the killing waters. But the most striking change was the tone inside the boats. Once filled with proud songs and jokes, U-boats had become tombs of silence. Even the traditional pre-patrol celebrations, once loud and spirited, dwindled into rituals of forced smiles and concealed dread. Germany's propaganda machine still broadcast visions of heroic U-boat triumphs, but the men under the waves knew the truth. They knew the Allies were no longer reacting. They were anticipating. They knew the Wolfpacks were outdated. They knew the ocean that once protected them now betrayed them with every sonar pulse. The silent mutiny was not a rejection of Germany. It was a loss of faith in its leadership. The men continued to fight, but their hearts were no longer in Berlin's hands. They sailed because they were ordered to, not because they believed in victory. And as this quiet rebellion spread, the fate of the U-boat fleet was sealed long before the last submarine disappeared beneath the Atlantic. By the spring of 1943, the Atlantic Ocean, once the hunting ground of Germany's proud U-boat arm, had transformed into something unrecognizable. Where commanders once spoke of opportunities and easy kills, they now whispered of terror and inevitability. The turning point came in a single, catastrophic month, a month etched into the memory of every surviving submariner. May 1943, the month Germany lost 41 U-boats. To the sailors who lived it felt like the ocean itself had turned against them. Patrol orders were issued as usual, with Dönitz urging his shrinking fleet to push forward, to renew their pressure on Allied convoys. But the men who climbed aboard the U-boats sensed something different. The air around them felt heavier, the farewells more somber. Mothers lingered a little longer, wives fought back tears. Even hardened sailors avoided looking back as their boats slipped from the docks, because too many had done so for the last time. The first reports arrived within days. One U-boat vanished without sending a signal. Another surfaced under air attack and was torn apart before the crew could escape. A third was cornered by new destroyers using advanced sonar, hunted for 11 hours straight before finally being smashed apart by depth charges that grew frighteningly precise. But these incidents were not isolated. They were the new reality. Allied technology had advanced beyond anything Berlin imagined possible. Long-range aircraft now patrolled vast sections of the ocean that had previously been safe zones for escort carriers, floating airfields, roamed the sea, launching planes that could appear out of nowhere. Radar grew sharper, sonar more sensitive, and intelligence more terrifyingly accurate. One commander returning from a patrol, cut short by relentless pursuit, described the experience in his log. "It is as if the sea has eyes. We are spotted before we see anything. We dive, and they already know where we are. Their depth charges fall as though guided by a hand." Many German officers suspected a leak or a spy. Others believed the Allies had developed some form of supernatural detection. Few realized the true cause, the cracking of the Enigma code. But whether they understood the mechanism or not, the effect was unmistakable. They were being hunted with precision that defied explanation. The losses mounted daily. U-boats crushed under pressure. Crews suffocated or drowned. Boats surfaced only to be riddled with bullets from circling aircraft. The Atlantic, once a vast expanse favoring the stealth of submarines, had shrunk into a killing field with nowhere to hide. At BDU headquarters, Dönitz stared at the casualty reports with shaking hands. Every U-boat loss meant 40 to 50 elite sailors, men he had trained, admired, and believed in. Now their faces blurred into numbers on pages stained with sweat and grief. Some commanders refused to send their men out again. Others obeyed orders, but prepared mentally for death. New recruits, barely out of training, were thrown into boats to replace crews that had vanished, and they too disappeared into the depths within weeks. News of the disaster was kept from the German public. Even Hitler was shielded from the full scale of the collapse, until it became impossible to hide. But the sailors knew. Every man boarding a U-boat in May 1943 understood he was entering a graveyard. By the end of the month, the truth was undeniable. The U-boat arm, once celebrated, feared, and admired, had been broken. Not gradually, not symbolically, but violently, decisively, and irreversibly. 41 U-boats lost. Thousands of men gone. A navy gutted in 30 days. Germany did not just lose submarines that month. It lost the Battle of the Atlantic. As the casualty reports piled up on his desk, Admiral Karl Dönitz felt the weight of the Atlantic pressing down on him like a physical force. The losses of the past months, 41 U-boats, in May alone, were more than a statistic. They were the shattering of a dream that had once promised Germany control over the seas. Yet, across Berlin, Hitler remained in his bunker, shielded from the magnitude of the disaster, clinging to illusions of omnipotence and invincibility. Dönitz knew that his next steps would not only determine the fate of the U-boat arm, but also test the limits of his loyalty to a leader increasingly divorced from reality. He called a series of high-level meetings, each one more tense than the last. U-boat commanders, strategically brilliant but emotionally drained, reported from the front lines with a mixture of frustration and despair. They described convoys that had once been vulnerable, now fortified by endless streams of escort ships, aircraft carriers, and radar-equipped destroyers. Every tactic that had previously guaranteed success had been neutralized, every advantage rendered moot by Allied innovation. Dönitz listened with a growing sense of helplessness. Each word confirmed a truth he could no longer ignore. The Battle of the Atlantic was effectively lost. Despite the mounting evidence, Hitler refused to acknowledge the scale of the crisis. He clung to outdated strategies and demanded that Dönitz continue aggressive patrols, insisting that victory was still possible through sheer force of will. Reports of entire flotillas destroyed in hours were dismissed as exaggerations. When Dönitz tried to explain that the situation had reached a tipping point, that the U-boat fleet could no longer dominate the Atlantic, Hitler's response was a mixture of disbelief and anger. He accused him of cowardice, of undermining the Reich's destiny, and demanded renewed attacks on Allied shipping. Dönitz was caught between duty and reality. On one hand, he owed allegiance to the Führer, and the ideals that had once made the U-boat arm the backbone of Germany's naval power. On the other, he could see with unerring clarity that obedience without adaptation would lead to annihilation. The gulf between the operational truth and Hitler's perception widened daily. Meetings devolved into arguments, with Dönitz presenting hard data and Hitler countering with ideology and hope. It was a battle of logic against fantasy, strategy against ego. The commander's reports painted a grim tableau. U-boats hunted relentlessly, forced to dive repeatedly, suffering casualties from depth charges, and being tracked through intelligence breakthroughs unknown to them. Many veterans spoke in whispers of the eyes in the sky and the endless traps, referring to the new technologies that had rendered stealth virtually impossible. The Atlantic, once a theater of German dominance, had become a perilous expanse where every patrol was a gamble with death. Dönitz understood that without immediate adjustments, reduced patrols, new tactics, and perhaps even a strategic withdrawal, the U-boat fleet could be decimated entirely. Privately, Dönitz drafted contingency plans, knowing full well that Hitler would resist any acknowledgement of retreat or tactical compromise. These plans involved dispersing remaining U-boats, focusing on defensive operations, and preserving the fleet for the long war that was now inevitable. He weighed each decision carefully, aware that the choices he made could save or doom thousands of men, and ultimately determine the survival of Germany's naval power. Yet even as he planned, the shadow of Hitler's denial loomed large, a constant reminder that reality and ideology were on a collision course. By the end of the month, Dönitz realized the truth that no leader could fully accept. The Atlantic was lost, and Germany's navy was only a shadow of its former might. The question remained not whether the U-boat arm would survive, but how long it could endure under a Führer who refused to see the ocean for what it had become. The loss of the Atlantic had shaken Dönitz to his core, but surrender was never part of his nature. He understood that while Hitler remained in denial, the U-boat arm still had a role to play if only it adapted. Sitting in his command office in Flensburg, Dönitz pored over maps, convoy routes, and intelligence reports, determined to transform desperation into calculated strategy. He war at sea was no longer a theater of German dominance. It had become a game of survival, requiring ingenuity, cunning, and ruthless prioritization. He began issuing directives that reflected a stark new reality. Gone were the days of massed Wolfpack attacks with predictably catastrophic risks. Now, U-boats would operate in smaller, stealthier groups, avoiding heavily defended convoys and focusing on vulnerable supply lines. He emphasized intelligence-driven targeting, relying on decrypted communications and reconnaissance to anticipate Allied movements. Every decision carried the weight of necessity. The survival of his crews and the possibility of prolonging Germany's naval influence depended on their precision. Dönitz faced resistance. Some commanders viewed these changes as cowardice, a surrender of the offensive spirit that had defined the U-boat arm since the war's outset. Others struggled with morale, worn down by relentless losses and haunted by the ghosts of comrades who never returned from patrols. Dönitz's new leadership required more than issuing orders. It required instilling a sense of purpose even in the face of dwindling odds. He spoke to his men not as a bureaucrat, but as a fellow sailor, acknowledging the losses, respecting the bravery, and framing the strategic pivot as a calculated, intelligent response to overwhelming enemy power. The new directives extended beyond tactical adjustments. Dönitz ordered enhanced training for evasive maneuvers, night attacks, and coordinated strikes that minimized exposure to air patrols. Supply and maintenance chains were reorganized to keep boats operational despite Allied interdiction, and communication protocols were tightened to prevent leaks that could compromise operations. Every initiative was designed to maximize efficiency, conserve resources, and protect human life, while still striking where the enemy least expected it. Yet, All the strategic brilliance in the world could not erase the looming shadow of Hitler's denial. Orders from Berlin often contradicted operational realities, demanding continued aggression and unrealistic results. Dönitz navigated this treacherous terrain with careful diplomacy, sometimes bending the truth, sometimes selectively omitting facts to preserve both credibility and operational freedom. It was a delicate balance. Obey the Führer, protect the fleet, and survive long enough to fight another day. Despite these efforts, the Atlantic remained hostile. Allied air superiority and convoy defenses continued to inflict devastating losses, and Dönitz knew each patrol could be the last for many of his men. Yet even in adversity, small victories became a measure of hope. A successful interception, a well-executed ambush, a convoy disrupted. These were not victories in the grand sense, but they were lifelines. Reminders that the U-boat arm could adapt, survive, and strike intelligently, even in a theater increasingly dominated by enemy innovation. As he drafted further operational plans, Dönitz reflected on the harsh reality. Germany had lost the strategic initiative, but the U-boat arm could still influence the pace and scope of the Allied supply effort. Survival and impact had become intertwined goals. By reshaping tactics, preserving lives, and striking with precision, Dönitz hoped to maintain relevance in a war slipping out of the Reich's control. The pivot was more than strategy. It was a testament to adaptability, a recognition that even in defeat, mastery of the seas was possible through skill, discipline, and unyielding resolve. The summer of 1943 had brought no relief for the Kriegsmarine. Reports of U-boat losses continued to pour in, each one a stark reminder that the Battle of the Atlantic was no longer a contest Germany could control. Dönitz had adapted, reorganized, and pivoted his operations, yet the reality could no longer be ignored. The intelligence was irrefutable. The Allies had cracked the codes, built impenetrable convoy systems, and dominated the skies above the Atlantic. With long-range aircraft, every strategy the U-boat arm had relied on was now countered, often before it could be implemented. And now, the burden fell upon Hitler himself, as the grim truth reached the Führer's ears in a series of briefings that he could no longer dismiss. In the grand, austere conference room of the Führer headquarters, Dönitz stood before Hitler. Flanked by senior naval officers and staff, he presented his data with the precision and gravity of a man delivering a death sentence to his own ambitions. Graphs of convoy losses, U-boat attrition rates, and projected fleet depletion were laid bare, each statistic a dagger to the illusions of German naval supremacy. Hitler's gaze was unreadable, his expression carefully neutral, yet the tension in the room was palpable. He had been insulated from defeat for too long, but this was undeniable. The Atlantic was slipping through his fingers, and with it, the lifeline of the Reich. Dönitz spoke without embellishment. He described the relentless Allied air patrols, the advanced sonar technology, and the efficient, coordinated escort systems that had made the Wolfpack myth obsolete. He explained the drastic reduction in operational effectiveness, the impossibility of sustaining long-term campaigns under such conditions, and the limited avenues left for impact. Each word was carefully measured, balancing honesty with deference. Dönitz knew that to blunt a statement could provoke anger, but to soften approach would mask the severity of the crisis. The message was clear. The Atlantic could no longer be won, and further insistence on victory would result only in the annihilation of the remaining U-boat fleet. Hitler listened, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes narrowing as he processed the implications. The Atlantic had always been a point of pride, a theater where Germany had dominated with cunning and fearsome efficiency. To concede it was to accept a fundamental weakness in his strategy, a crack in the facade of invincibility he had long projected. Yet the data was unassailable, the losses undeniable, and the projected outcomes for continued operations catastrophic. In that moment, the Führer confronted a reality he had resisted for years. The strategic initiative had irrevocably shifted to the Allies, and the ocean that once symbolized German might was now a theater of inevitable defeat. Dönitz did not wait for a response. He outlined a series of contingency measures, retraining U-boat crews for limited high-value strikes, focusing on defensive operations near the European coast, and preserving the core of the fleet for future engagements where the odds could be managed. Every recommendation was rooted in pragmatism, a final attempt to salvage operational relevance and mitigate the losses that Hitler's denial had inflicted. Teehee conversation was tense, a collision of raw data and ideological resistance. Yet Dönitz remained composed, a steady hand against the backdrop of a crumbling naval strategy. Hitler finally spoke, his tone measured but tinged with reluctant acknowledgement. He questioned, probed, and demanded assurances. But the realization had taken hold. The Atlantic could no longer serve as the lifeline of the Reich. IT was a concession, not fully embraced, but undeniable. The strategic pivot proposed by Dönitz became the new directive, marking a turning point in Germany's naval history. The Wolfpacks, once the terror of the Atlantic, were relegated to defensive operations, a shadow of their former dominance, yet a testament to disciplined adaptation in the face of overwhelming odds. As the meeting concluded, Dönitz left the room with a heavy sense of both relief and burden. The confrontation had crystallized the inevitable, transforming months of grim reports and lost ships into a strategic reality Hitler could no longer ignore. The Battle of the Atlantic was lost, not with the fury of fire and explosion, but through the quiet calculus of attrition, intelligence, and the relentless innovation of the Allies. It was a moment that underscored the limits of ideology against strategy, the cost of denial in war, and the indomitable logic of a conflict increasingly dictated by those who mastered both information and adaptation. Germany's control of the Atlantic had ended, and with it, a decisive chapter of naval history closed forever.